Have the slides up on our screen.
Oh, sorry. I'll let some folks in. We'll say a quick welcome. Hello, welcome. We are so happy to have you. We are going to wait just a few minutes and try to let some people in. About 3 after, we'll get going. If you'd like to go ahead and start firing up the chat, tell us where you're from. Maybe hopefully scale of 1 to 10, how much you know about bonds, because we have the experts here for you all today, which is so exciting. My name is Millie Hurt. I'm the National Vice President of WAN. If I haven't seen you in a while, hello, welcome. I hope to see you at the summit in a few weeks. If you have not signed up for the summit, there's still some spots, but I know that we are probably closing in on being sold out soon. So please do not hesitate and wait. You can check out our website, click on the summit if you want to see what we have planned. Some awesome speakers are going to be there, like maybe some of the speakers that are here today. So shout out on that. Again, we'll give it a few minutes, see some stuff, trying to manage the chat and letting people in. So I apologize if I miss anything here while we're getting ready to get started. Hopefully everyone is having beautiful, sunshiny spring day. I know here in Ohio, we are ready for some warmer weather for sure. So welcome. We are filling up here. This is awesome. So many folks from around the country. Bonds are becoming the new hot thing, I think. Well, probably have been, but
bonds are bigger than Coachella, so happy to have everybody here.
Love that.
I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, Millie, if that works.
That would be great. While we're letting folks in, I would like to shout out not only to all of our sponsors of the National Women's Affordable Housing Network, but especially those today. We have 2 sponsors on and a couple of speakers to represent them. We have Tiber Hudson, who is a Washington, D.C. based boutique law firm focused in tax-exempt and taxable debt financing for affordable housing across the country. Tiber has been ranked as #1 Underwriters Council in the U.S. since its first full year of operations in 2018 and has a reputation for creating cutting-edge bond financing techniques that can be increased basis and build efficiency for projects. So thank you, Tiber Hudson. And I know we have Allison here today representing, and we're going to give our speakers a moment to, I am not sure, sorry. We're not going to allow AI in today. Sorry about that. I don't know if that's just a general thing that happens, but it kind of caught me off guard. While I admit a couple more people here. So again, thank you to Tiber Hudson. And then Elmington is a real estate development and investment company based out of Nashville, Tennessee, and founded in 2010. The company owns and manages commercial, multifamily, and single-family communities across the Southeast and is a national leader in the development and management of affordable housing. Currently, Elmington Affordable has developed over 11,000 units with another 5,500 in the pipeline. The property management company manages over 34,000 units across the country, and the construction team will have completed $1 billion in multifamily projects by the end of 2025. So congratulations on all that hard work. And we have Elsie Wallace here representing Elmington. So again, thank you for your sponsorship and your time. Let me let a few more people in, but I think at this point I will turn it over to Allison King, our moderator and specialist in this department. So again, thank you all, and thanks everyone for being here today.
Fantastic. Thank you, Millie. And just welcome everyone. I love to talk about bonds, so I'm really excited for the turnout that we have today. Today we're talking about bond basics, and this is going to be the first of a series. We're having sort of a 201 session at the summit, as Millie mentioned, and then also in the fall we're going to have an advanced panel. So please be on the lookout for those sessions. but today we're going to cover just kind of the basics. I feel like there's a lot of kind of mystery surrounding bonds, and folks get a bit intimidated when they start to look into these structures. But today we're hoping to demystify the bond process and kind of simplify that for you so you can have a better understanding. Again, my name is Allison King. I'm a partner at Tiber Hudson. We are a national law firm that focuses in affordable housing finance. And our role is underwriters counsel or bond purchasers counsel on these bond deals. I'm based in Charleston, South Carolina, and I'm going to pass it over to Elsie to introduce herself.
Hey y'all, I'm Elsie Wallace, and I'm here with Elmington Capital Group. We are based out of Nashville, Tennessee. I'm a Nashville local and native, and I've been with Elmington for the past 5 years.
All right, Gina's next on my screen.
Great. Good afternoon, everybody. Gina DiMartino. I'm a director in Stifel's Public Finance Group based in St. Louis, Missouri. We do the bond underwriting and placement services for multifamily housing projects all around the country. Happy to be here today.
And Heather.
Hey everyone, Heather Olson. I'm Managing Director with Berkadia Affordable on the mortgage banking side. I am based down in Palm Beach Gardens, Florida, and I've been in the industry, gosh, well over 15 years now, and with Berkadia for 4.
All right. Again, we have an hour for today's session. We may run a little bit long because this is a lot to cover. It is being recorded and the slides are available. If you want to reach out to me directly, I'm happy to share those with you or Juan. So let's get started by talking about LIHTC. So these are affordable housing projects, Greg. So you have reduced rents and you're looking for ways to fill the gap to offset those reduced rents. And so that's where the LIHTCs, the low-income housing tax credits, come in. And you have 2 flavors of these LIHTCs. You have the 9s, which are competitive, and the 4s, which are in theory non-competitive. So basically for the 9%, you can see that they generate a much larger slug when you're looking at your capital stack of about 65% compared to the 4%. And when I say in theory that these are non-competitive, you should be able to unlock those credits as of right, as long as you're using tax-exempt bonds. But the problem is those bonds are now sort of limited, and we'll talk about that on another slide. But 4%, you can see here, not quite as potent as the 9% credit, but a little bit easier to access. So in this example, generating about 35% of the tax credit or the capital stack in equity.
So as we show on this screen, the 4% tax credits require what we refer to as the 50% test. So more than 50% of the aggregate basis of the project has to be financed through tax-exempt municipal bonds. So we're showing here as the aggregate basis is both land plus the eligible basis. And that more than 50% is really 50.01%, but we don't want to push it too much. So most projects will be somewhere between the 51 to 55% of the aggregate basis is actually the tax exempt bond. But you do have to receive what we call the private activity bond allocation, which we will get into further in a couple slides.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Gina. 50% is definitely the very, very minimum. We have seen projects that have run into delays, cost overruns, and haven't been able to meet that 50% test and have to go back and get supplemental issuances of bonds, which can be very expensive. So definitely want to make sure you're allowing that cushion on the 50% test.
So as we get into what is a municipal bond is most commonly a tax-free investment. And what we mean by tax-free is that the investor who lends the money and receives their principal back plus the interest on the money they loan, they do not have to pay taxes on the interest that they receive. So that is the tax exempt interest that they are receiving. They are commonly used to fund roads, hospitals, bridges, schools, stadiums at this point in time, and housing projects. So we go through a little graphic, I believe, on this next page, Allison. So we start that they can be state debt instruments, they could be counties, they could be city governments, school districts. They fund roads. Letting you click through. We got roads and in schools and housing projects. So as you go through this, you've got the bond investor, the person that has the money. They deliver the money to the issuer. The issuer then has the money to build their project. And you fund up the affordable housing project.
Yeah, so this is a good example of a conduit issuance where that those funds are flowing through the issuer, but onto the borrower to be spent on the project. So ultimately, the borrower is responsible for the repayment of that loan. The issuer is not on the hook for that debt. Yeah, so volume cap is allocated by the IRS on an annual basis. And as mentioned, it's for this broader use of housing, schools, hospitals. It's based on per capita numbers or a minimum for smaller states. And this heat map really kind of helps us to understand this. The higher populated states are getting more volume cap. So you can see California, Texas, New York, Florida, these larger states getting more allocation. They are not taking away volume cap from other states. This is a per state basis, and states can't share across state lines. And so once that volume cap is allocated to a state, as Gina mentioned, it can be divided among those uses. So this map shows how much of that volume cap is, this is an estimate, of course, allocated to multifamily. So you can see states that are really prioritizing that multifamily use of their volume cap: Colorado, New York, Washington, California, are states that are really allocating a lot of that valuable resource to multifamily over the other uses mentioned, roads, schools, etc. So
Allison, do you know who in the state determines that allocation? Is it?
yeah, this is a great opportunity for those that are involved in lobbying efforts to talk to their elected officials. And so that's where that's decided. So it's on a state basis. And so it's a great opportunity as you kind of compare the states that are running out of volume cap for multifamily use. You know, if it's a state that's not allocating much of that resource to multifamily, there's an opportunity to increase that allocation. Yeah, states have a lot of autonomy for how they administer their program. So, and this, as I mentioned, is a heat map showing what states are running out of that scarce resource. So oversubscribed being in orange, parity and silver, and undersubscribed meaning the states that don't use up their volume cap in blue. So you can really see that most of our states are running into this volume cap scarcity, meaning that it's hard to get the bonds. Of course, the 4% are tied to the bonds. And so when you can't get bonds for your project, it does in turn make that 4% credit competitive. And again, states have autonomy as to how they administer their program. Some states like Texas has a lottery ball. You have some that it's first come, first serve. Some there are different scoring programs. And so having an understanding, and I know Elsie and her team work on deals across the country. So having, you know, a really specific understanding of the program of timing and sort of how that scoring or how those bonds are allocated is very important.
And it is just, I'll chime in here too. It is interesting how that has changed. It'd be interesting to see a map of just even in the past 5 to 10 years of the states that have flipped from being undersubscribed to being parity states and then to now being oversubscribed. But this does play in a huge, this is part of our strategy of how we go to new states. And we definitely look at all of these statistics.
yeah, when you layer these maps with states that offer, say, state tax credits and that type of thing, so that can really help you to narrow your focus and where you want to be. Yeah, and this is something that we've been tracking for years with Novogradac. So we do have the old maps, and it has definitely, you can see that orange color expanding across the country. As Gina mentioned, there is a 50% test. Y'all may have heard that there's sort of some momentum behind the idea of reducing that 50% test to 25% or 20%. So tracking that can also impact the availability of volume cap. I think the next question there would, what's the next constraint? I think having, additional deals may be hard for some issuers to manage in their pipeline. So having to staff up and that type of thing might be, effective constraint of getting your deals done in certain states. So this is a very valuable resource. Volume cap, again, is scarce. It's valuable because it comes with these 4% credits. And so how do we preserve that? As Gina mentioned, we're looking to limit the volume cap allocation for projects. This says 55 to 60%. That's a little bit generous, as Gina mentioned, really kind of that 55% target. And there are some issuers that actually limit the amount of volume cap that they will allocate to a project. Bifurcating transactions that are less than 100% affordable, so sort of breaking out that affordable piece and just financing that with bonds. Forward volume cap, you'll see some issuers that are prioritizing 20, 4% and 9% deals in their application rounds. Recycled bonds is something you may hear in these conversations at conferences. I will note that recycled bonds are available as a debt instrument, but they do not unlock those 4% credits. And so just a tool as far as financing a project. And then we'll talk a little bit more about investment strategy, additional bond proceeds. All right, the rules, the most exciting part of the presentation. So again, these are slides are going to be available for folks to go back and study on their own, but just wanted to briefly kind of run through these. Again, these are affordable housing projects, so there are set aside requirements of affordability. So just keeping that in mind. And then the project does have to be affordable for a certain period of time. So here it describes that that ends at the later of 15 years or the last date at which the bonds are outstanding, or the conclusion of a Section 8 contract if you have a Section 8 contract on the project. And then there are a lot of rules that are surrounding the use of those bond proceeds. And so again, this is a basics webinar, so we don't want to get too far in the weeds, but just keeping in mind that these are some of the tests that Bond Counsel, your accounting team are all keeping in mind, and a lot of the hoops that you kind of have to jump through in order to make sure that these bonds are being spent correctly. So the 95-5 test, you'll also hear this is the good cost, bad cost analysis. So bonds need to be spent on good costs. Bonds can't be spent on more than 2% of cost of issuance. So just keeping in mind issuer fees and some of those other things that are in your budget, you'll need to look to other sources of funds to cover those. And then acquisition of land, there's a limitation there as well. Other calculations that we're running is the bond maturity limitation. This is the weighted average maturity. You'll hear us talk about the WAM on closing calls and getting those numbers in order. And then there is a rehab requirement for AC rehab deals. I will note before we go into the timing that those are the bond rules. There are separate rules for tax credits. And so just keeping in mind that that you're layering that analysis with your tax credit team as well. So I'll pass it over to, I think Gina is going to walk through some of the initial steps here.
Perfect. Thanks, Allison. So we mentioned the conduit issuer on the earlier slide. That would be the municipal entity, typically a housing authority, a housing commission, or an industrial development authority. That the board of that authority has to approve the transaction. Most frequently, we see that that requires 2 approvals. Depending on who you're working with, sometimes that's just 1. But at that first approval is when they would approve an inducement resolution, and it typically comes with a reimbursement resolution component to it. And what that means is from the date of that issuance, the borrower can look to reimburse themselves for costs looking back 60 days from the date of that approval and then forward. So a lot of these projects would not be spending the money until you actually get to the closing, but sometimes we're working on projects where they're actively spending some money before the closing, and this just allows them to repay themselves after we get to a closing table. Then on the next slide, we get to the timeline. So we typically set this up for a public offering to take about 4 months. So we set this up for 120 days. We have a kickoff call. There's drafting of both the bond documents as well as the disclosure or the offering document. That is the document that Stifel, as the underwriter, would use to go out and explain the structure, the security, the collateral, the repayment source, and everything else about the project to the potential holders. Potential purchasers. We have a rating agency process, which requires all of those documents to be existing before you go seek the rating. And then there's different approvals, both the issuer approval. We have what is called the TEFRA hearing. That's what has to be, it's a public hearing that has to be held by the issuer before you can actually issue the tax exempt bonds. That's the TE portion of TEFRA. We have the lender commitment and rate lock. Then after everything's basically buttoned up, you have the rating, everything else is ready to go. Then we post what we call the POS, the preliminary official statement, which allows Stifel then as the underwriter to go out and find the bondholders, price the bonds. That's when we rate lock the interest rate. And then about a week or 2 later, we actually get to an official closing. One thing I will note with a bond issue, once we price the bonds, the closing cannot move. I know in some other types of transactions, whether it's a bank deal, that can be kind of a fluctuating date, but our bondholders know the date. We do trades. We cannot break those trades without penalties and everything else that would have to be passed back to the borrower if we did it. So we just don't do that. We want to get to bond pricing and know that everything else is locked in so we get to that closing date and don't have any issues.
Yeah, and I would add, through this timeline, the developers also layering in, finalizing their plan and cost, getting their permits ready, all of the other development stuff is going to follow this timeline to get to that closing.
Thanks.
Yeah, I will say, a question that comes up pretty often is like the difference between a publicly offered deal versus a private placement. And I think there's kind of some bad information about how a publicly offered deal does add more time to a project's closing. And it does add a small amount of time, but ultimately, that difference between posting, pricing, and closing are only really kind of the course of a week or so. And then having, most of these deals are also aligned with due diligence requirements, committee approval processes for lenders and equity. So really the bond timeline does fall within all of that timing as well.
Yeah, and all parties are working together with weekly check-in calls going through this process to make sure that everyone is staying on track to hit the timing.
We had a question in the chat about whether there's ever an issue where there's no purchaser of the bonds.
As in no one comes in to be available? Is that what?
Yeah, I would say, when you look at it from the 2 different lenses of a private placement versus a publicly offered deal. So a private placement is you're lining up a single purchaser for the bonds. And there have been instances when maybe the market conditions change or something happens and that purchaser may have to walk away from a deal, and that's very rare. That doesn't happen very often, but it can happen. In a publicly offered transaction, you're offering these deals to, you know, Gina and Stifel and her desk are taking these bonds out to market, and you have investors that are competing. So you have multiple opportunities for purchasers to come in and buy those bonds. So ultimately, that's driving the price down, and you do have more options for a purchaser.
And Allison, I would note, I mean, there are things that are out of all of our control and everyone's control on the transaction. If we step away from affordable housing into all municipal bonds in the country, last week, there were supposed to be $9 or $10 billion of bonds priced. Because of everything that was being announced with tariffs or changes to tariffs, about 4.4 billion in bonds was all that got priced. Everything else basically went on the shelf, and only things that absolutely had to get priced were there. The bondholders were paused and waiting. So that's not something that happens every month by any means like that. But there are times when things completely out of our control would delay that, or there would not be a buyer.
Yeah.
And then somebody asked what POS stands for. That is the preliminary official statement or the offering document or prospectus.
And I would say with the private placement, I mean, the bond purchaser, it's to their discretion, right? So if they want to or not in certain markets, you know, they'll pass on that deal. Or if it just doesn't fit into their box, if they can't get to your proceeds that you're looking for, it's a little bit different.
Yeah. And if the deal doesn't have like a drop dead, I know LC, like
then,
generally you're
like when
hoping
Gina
to get
takes
to
the deal
market
out to the
before
market.
yeah, you want to get to market before your drop dead date. Like if a
Mhm.
sales contract is expiring or you're running out, your volume cap is expiring, you're hoping to go to market with some cushion there. So if you do have to, like Gina described, put your deal on the shelf for a couple of days, let the market settle down, you have that space to do that.
That's right. We typically try to buffer whatever the drop dead date is, whether that's driven from the state agency, THDA, or in other states. If they have a volume cap expiration, we'll buffer in a few weeks for that purpose, and knowing that the market can change and wanting to mitigate that risk.
Yeah. I'm going to skip through some of these other rules. I know we're want to get onto some of the structures. A few things that I think would be helpful when you start these kickoff calls. Usually the underwriter or the lender is kind of putting together this distribution list in the beginning. So it can be pretty intimidating to be on a call where there can be 30 people. You have all of these different players, and what are they doing and what documents are they preparing? So this is just kind of showing all of these different parties coming in and supporting and loving the borrower who is ultimately driving the transaction. Gina, would you like to walk through some of the parties that are involved on the bond side?
Absolutely. So we've talked about the issuer a fair amount already. The obligor, also known as the borrower, that is the person responsible to repay the bonds. The authorizing body is the governing board of that issuer, the Industrial Development Authority Board or the Housing Commission. We have the bond trustee, which is the pass-through entity that will hold the bond proceeds, and then when the bondholders are getting repaid, the money will pass back through them. The underwriter, in this case, most commonly Stifel, we would be the one finding the purchasers. There are frequently municipal advisors, sometimes referred to as financial advisors. They are the ones that can give advice to the issuer or the obligor, but they do not go out and find the purchaser. Bond counsel is the person that drafts all of the legal bond documents and delivers the tax opinion on the bonds being tax exempt. Underwriters counsel is the person that represents the underwriter, drafts the offering document that goes out to solicit buyers. Borrowers counsel represents the obligor or the borrower. The issuer has their counsel, so another lawyer, and the rating agency, it would be Moody's, S&P, or Fitch. Is the fiscal agent the same as the trustee?
That's right. Yeah, so fiscal agent, you'll see and Heather will get more into detail on the tax exempt loan program, a TEL. Essentially a TEL is the same thing as a bond. It just has different terminology. So the TEL can be used to meet the 50% test. And then fiscal agent is the terminology used for the trustee in those transactions. We also had a question about conduit financing. So in these examples, these are all conduit deals. So essentially, the issuer is passing through that loan to the borrower. Now, the borrower can decide once they have that volume cap allocation, like what is the execution that they want on the deal. So is it a private placement? Is it a publicly offered deal? Pooled financing is a little bit of a different thing, but I would say publicly offered to a larger market of investors is maybe the concept that we're thinking about here. And then we'll have our lender jump in on.
Yeah, I'll jump in. Just a heads up, I'm apparently cutting out and getting notifications of an unstable internet. So if I freeze up, let me know. But yeah, so in addition to all the other parties, you will have a permanent lender on all of your deals. We'll have counsel that represents us. And then your LIHTC equity will also obviously have a huge part in the deal structure, and they'll have their counsel also on all these calls. And in some of your deals, you will see these players, maybe not on all, just depending on your particular deal and how it's structured. So really in the 4% space, you'll hear there's the structure of either it's the forward immediate funding. So in an immediate funding, you'll see these on substantial rehab deals, most of them with Section 8 contracts where they're getting those post-rehab rents day one. So we can come in as your perm lender also on day one, since we're underwriting that cash flow that's immediately there. If this is a new construction or it's a substantial rehab where your rehab, your higher rents aren't recognized or not obtained until after the rehab's done, or obviously the construction and lease up is complete, then you will need a construction lender on those deals. So when you close the whole deal, we close on our forward commitment for the perm at the same time that the rest of the deal closes, including your construction loan. So you'll have a construction lender on those deals. You'll also, obviously, they'll have their legal representation. And then if it is a publicly offered bond, those bonds have to be rated. So you'll have a rating agency on those if they're privately placed, or the tax exempt note program. Those are not non-rated bonds. And then the same thing that Gina mentioned with the municipal advisors, some issuers require an advisor, some do not. So you won't see those on every transaction.
I think we covered that. All right, so we know that there are a lot of different players out there. We know that there are a lot of different executions. And so how do we decide? We have a project. How do we decide what type of financing? Do we need a construction lender? Are we using Fannie? Are we using Freddie? Are we using HUD in connection with those bonds? So let's talk about some of the important market indicators that help us to inform that decision.
And so we have a few slides on different market things. We're looking at both the 10-year US Treasury on this slide, as well as the 10-year MMD. MMD stands for Municipal Market Data. That is the tax exempt index, where the US Treasury is a taxable index for a taxable transaction. So this is a point in time over daily rate over the past 3 years of the US Treasury, the light blue line at the top, versus the MMD, which is the dark blue line. The red line that we have is the historical average of the US Treasury, and that's over like a 20-year period, where the green line is the historical average over a 20-year period of the MMD index. So most commonly, your MMD should be below the Treasury because it is tax exempt. But you can see where there's little blips in early 2022 at the beginning of this graph, where the dark blue is actually above that. So we're just monitoring the difference between how these most commonly move together. They look a lot together, but sometimes the one goes down and the other goes up. So we are monitoring those differences every day.
Yeah, and we did have a question, it's timely. In your experience, do sponsors prefer private placements over public offerings? And I think all of this analysis of what's happening in the market definitely informs that decision. So some of these products are priced off of different indicators. And so that can really make a difference in your rate on your bonds and the ultimate execution that you decide.
Heather, did you want to take this one? Or do you want me to?
You can take this one. I was gonna take
Oh.
this before.
Yep, all good. No, sounds good. So this one is, the last one we were looking at the 10-year point of just over a 3-year period. This one we're looking at from year 1 through year 30 about the US Treasury versus the MMD. So you can see in the red line is the current US Treasury 1 year at a 379 versus the MMD 1 year is at a 251. And then all the way out to the 30-year point, how close the 30-year US Treasury is at a 437 to the 30-year MMD at a 407. So when there's a wider difference at the short end than when you get to the long end, and they're very close together.
And then I would point out, we're looking on the perm side for the longer term, right? So we're pricing, if this is a private placement or a TEL, we're pricing over the 10-year UST. And then it's over on the publicly offered bonds, it's over the 18 or 20-year MMD. So when you're looking at this on the long term, we're not really looking at the 1 year, but we're looking out to the 10, 18, and 20.
Yep. And when you hear terms like the yield curve is flat, I mean, you can see here that it's a fairly flat curve. So that's just sort of some of the terminology you'll hear when people are discussing rates. Inverted yield curve means something else, and we've been in an inverted yield curve up until recently. So,
well, and look at the US Treasury. That's still the 1 year is higher than the 2 year. So that one is inverted.
yep.
And then when you're looking at your full interest rate stack on the differences, so for the publicly traded bonds, you're looking at it would probably be, the 18-year MMD rate plus the investor spread that when Gina goes out to sell the bonds, they're going to get that spread for you from their investors. And then there's going to be a guarantee and servicing spread also to that. That's coming from Fannie Mae. Those four really combined is going to set your full interest rate stack. On your private placements or your Freddie TELs, it's going to be the 10-year rate plus the spread in servicing that Freddie sets. So that's the differences in what makes up your full interest rate stack.
Yeah, the question was private placements being benchmarked to the Treasury versus public to the MMD. I think it's more of a question of bonds being tied to the MMD versus public placement. That's not the distinction, but the publicly offered bonds are tied to the MMD.
And I think a question just came up that with the private placement saving, there less cost on those versus the public offerings. Why would you go public offering? Well, the pricing of the MMD is well inside of the 10 years. So we have seen in the last year, all-in interest rate differences on the Fannie public offering of 100 basis points. So when you're in a market where you are right now, and your debt service constrained on almost every deal you're looking at, you could be getting millions more in proceeds from the MTEB versus your other options, and the proceeds more than offset the higher cost of the public offering. So you really need to do and work with your lenders and your financing partners to do what we call kind of like a net comparison of all the products. I know we're about to get into the different products, but just overall proceeds with your interest rates versus the costs to see which works best for you.
Yeah, so let's talk about some of the products. So this is the short-term cashback bond structure is one that's kind of been the bread and butter of the industry for the last couple of decades. It can be used with a lot of different taxable perm loans. And so you can use this with HUD, RD, taxable Fannie. You can do local loans, and then soft funds can be used as well. There's some developers that focus on getting CDBG disaster relief funds, FEMA, and some other funding that might be available. So the reason that you might choose this product is that you have very favorable underwriting terms for this taxable loan. So FHA, I know some developers love it, some developers hate it. It can take a little bit more time, but often the terms are very favorable, and so can win out for some folks. But remember, we have to meet the 50% test to get the bonds, to get the tax credits. So you're marrying that taxable loan with this short-term bond that's essentially outstanding just to meet your 50% test to unlock those 4% credits, and then it goes away. So let's walk through how that works. So at closing, you're going to have the bonds being sold publicly through Gina at CFL. Those bonds are going to be fully funded on day one. The full amount of the bonds, these are not drawn down, but fully funded and deposited with the trustee. Again, these are short-term cash-backed bonds. So the bonds are, the bond holders are looking to that cash collateral that's held with the trustee for security. They don't have security in the project itself. The perm loan will the perm lender will fund its lender funds to the trustee instead of going directly to the borrower, because remember, those bond proceeds have to be spent on the project in order to meet your 50% test. And so bond proceeds are going to be released, maintaining at all times enough cash collateral for the bondholder to be fully collateralized. So again, each draw, those dollars are going to flow through, be spent on the project, and that continues until all of the bond proceeds have been spent. In this example, the perm loan is greater than the amount of the bond, so any remaining amounts can go directly to the borrower. And then once the project is placed in service, the trustee can then use that cash collateral to pay off the bondholders, and that piece goes away. So these, again, are short-term cashback bonds. They're only outstanding for about 2 to 3 years until that construction period is completed. Any debt service payments are then made to the perm lender going forward. So in this example, the perm loan was greater than the amount of the bonds, but you may have to look to other sources of collateral. So tax exempt or tax credit, equity bridge, seller notes, subordinate loan proceeds can be used to collateralize the bonds if the loan amount is smaller than the bonds. And there are a lot of benefits to this structure. So the bonds are only outstanding for 2 to 3 years. So the issuer fees are lower. You're only paying certain fees for a couple of years. There's a 266 election that you can take. I know, Elsie, we walked through that on a lot of your projects. The idea being that you're able to take that interest on the bonds as well as that interest on your taxable loan in your calculation for basis. And so there's additional equity that can be generated just by having those bonds. And then based on current market conditions, that equity or that cash that's sitting with the trustee is not just sitting there uninvested. That cash is being reinvested into treasuries, as Gina described, which are higher than the bond rate. So you're actually getting positive arbitrage offsetting the cost of those bonds. So essentially the bonds are sitting out there for free.
I can
And LC, we closed one together in Alabama, Old
Yeah.
Monrovia.
Old Monrovia Flats. I can jump in here. This is our first project in Alabama, and so we went with the short-term cashback structure here for a number of reasons. And Allison, you just touched on a few, but AHFA is the state finance and housing agency there, and how they've written their QAP and bond program description, it favors this structure. Excuse me, it favors this structure, and this structure is, like Allison said, been around for decades. And so when we made this analysis, we chose to do a HUD D4 loan here, and we worked with Walker and Dunlap on this. We have managed a lot of commercial space in Huntsville, and we really love the Huntsville market. And so we have a few more projects that have come in behind this project, but one of the reasons that we really went with this structure as well was the long-term issuer fees and fees through AHFA, that's always a mouthful, that would burn off after the construction period, just because we would have fully utilized the bonds here. So that's kind of a general understanding of why we went with that structure on this project.
Yeah, Elsie brought up a really good point, because there are some states and issuers that don't like certain structures. So, Alabama does not like the private placement structure. And so you're not going to look at a private placement or a Freddie Tel in Alabama. You're going to want to move towards the Fannie Mae or the HUD 221 D4 structure. So, it's not always just, let's see what's the best structure across the board for your deal. Sometimes you are limited by your state agency too.
I love how smart our audience is, because it's always a really, the first question we get about positive arbitrage is, can we keep it for the benefit of the deal, right? Can we keep those positive earnings? And the answer is, it depends. So in this short-term cash collateralized structure, in most circumstances, you're not able to keep it. It's considered positive arbitrage, and therefore it has to be rebated to the IRS at the end of the day. So we will run rebate calculations and make sure that we're not running afoul of arbitrage rules. That said, as Gina described, that spread has become pretty wide in certain circumstances. So it's kind of painful to write that check to the IRS at the end of the day. I mean, it's on autopilot. The trustee has those funds, so you're not coming out of pocket for it. But you think like, wow, that could really help the deal. And so we've created some opportunities, and we'll talk about it with the MTEB. There's also a structure called the cashback forward that can potentially allow you to yield blend and capture those positive earnings. Positive arbitrage always has to go to the IRS, but positive earnings, if you structure the deal in the correct way, may potentially be used for the benefit of the deal. So the MTEM, I feel like last year has been the year of the MTEM. We've seen a ton of these being done across the country. Let's see.
I can go through part of this, Allison, and then you can go through some of the benefits.
Okay.
You'll have to update the slide, because they have kind of changed their guidance on that 40-year AM, and it's pretty much not, I won't say given, but they're being way more generous with it now, Allison.
Great.
Perfect. So a Fannie Mae MTEMS. MTEMS stands for multifamily tax exempt mortgage-backed securities. So it's in general a tax exempt financing for the permanent loan portion of the 4% LIHTC transaction. It's monthly pay bonds, which will pass through the principal and the interest payments from the Fannie Mae permanent mortgage to the bondholders following the delivery of the permanent loan. And it really streamlined the execution that brings the efficiency from that Fannie Mae MBS to the municipal bond market, because as we've been talking about, you have to meet the 50% test when we're talking about the 4% LIHTC projects. So we have DUS lenders on these projects that underwrite the transaction, and they close the permanent loan and deliver the MBS. And Fannie Mae then guarantees that direct pass-through of the principal and interest to the bondholders, which is very attractive to those purchasers. So we also have a diagram, I think, on this next page that flows through. So again, we've got the bondholder sends their money to the trustee. They deliver the tax exempt bonds to the bondholder to hold that. Construction lender funds the money to the trustee, similar to what we've been doing on the last one. Project starts getting funded. Keep flowing that through.
Quick construction.
It's amazing.
We
And
wish.
so, yes, the MTEM stands for tax exempt mortgage-backed security.
You'll also hear MTEB. So it's the same program.
And then upon conversion, we get the permanent lenders money coming in. Sorry, the equity money first, then they go away. Permanent lender steps in. We have our MBS delivered.
And so at this point, the MBS is collateralizing the bonds instead of that cash. So that's a bit of a distinction here. And as Heather mentioned, the reason we have a separate construction lender is Fannie doesn't take construction risk. So in this example of forward commitment, forward MTEM, you will have a third-party construction lender.
And it's good to know, and kind of when we look at the different programs with the bond, publicly offered bond structure, you can only have one tax exempt, what's the word I'm looking for, tax exempt debt out at one time. So when you are doing the tax exempt bonds in this Fannie Mae forward structure, your construction loan has to be taxable. So only one tax exempt instrument is allowed.
Yeah, so some of the benefits of the structure, I know that this group is asking, and they see through, kind of the complication, and there's some fees that are associated with that kind of execution, additional parties. But why are people choosing the MTEM, and why was it such a big hit last year? And we're off to a strong start with it this year as well. There's just so many benefits. Yield blending, as I mentioned, we can potentially capture those positive earnings for the benefit of the deal. Additional equity, as we talked about, taking that 266 election for taking that construction interest and bond interest into your basis calculation. And then, as Heather mentioned, I think the really big sort of takeaway is that the greater loan proceeds. So you may have additional fees, but you're getting more money for the deal. Earnings on those bond proceeds do count towards a 50% test. And then again, as Heather mentioned, there are a lot of instances where the equity investor and construction lender want to be the same party, right? And so having this publicly offered piece will keep you from triggering the program investment test, which would cause issues with issuer fees that are higher than 12.5 basis points. So again, this is helpful to visualize some of the benefits here, additional proceeds, but based on that MTEM pricing being off of the MMD bond rate. Yield blending, we've talked about. If we're able to blend yields here, with those costs built in, you're having this net benefit for the project. And we're kind of running short on time. So I know folks are going to have the slides afterwards to dig through this. And I think you can reach out to any of our panelists to kind of go more in the weeds on how this calculation is done. But essentially here, we're looking at the additional cost of issuance being part of the analysis. But ultimately, when you take into account that yield blending, as well as that additional equity based on your 266 election, potentially the MTEB in this example is generating savings of close to $1 million. Hillside Flats. You guys make some really great looking projects, Elsie.
Thank you. I'm only a small fraction of the design piece. We try to we have a great team that puts their input in, but we're proud of this one, Hillside Flats. I'll be brief, but we developed this as part of a master development. We purchased a 26-acre piece of land in the Edge Hill neighborhood in Nashville, just down the street from where our office is located. And there were 290 units of affordable housing here, and they were not maintained very well. They were an older product, and we did a 1-for-1 swap. We built 290 units on 4 acres, and then we redeveloped the additional 22 acres into single family homes, into townhomes, and then there's some market rate units going up here currently. And so we were in between. We studied the Fannie and the Freddie here to do an MTEB or a Freddie TEL. And the biggest reasoning that we chose the Fannie here was the investor. Our investor was a small regional bank, or is a small regional bank, and they had some concern with how the Freddie TEL was structured, in just terms of it came down to a legal discrepancy there. And so at this point, the rates for both were very favorable. In 2019, rates were low, and we had a CITC on this project as well, which is a construction loan that is priced at prime -4. And so we had a $70 million construction loan that we paid 0 interest on for the entirety of construction, which is impossible to come by today. But and so that's the general reasoning and kind of how we structured this deal. And we partnered with a nonprofit that was currently on the 26 acres that we purchased. They run an after-school daycare and just after-school program for families in the Edge Hill neighborhood. They're named Salama, and so we built them a space within our development as well. And so they're a long-term partner with us in the deal, and we have a great relationship with them. And there's a school across the street, so this is a special deal to us at Elmington for sure.
Gorgeous.
Thank you.
All right, private placements.
Yeah, so you've heard us throw around the term private placements versus public offering bonds. And I'm going to make this quick because I know we got just a couple minutes left. So, one of the biggest competitors to the Fannie MTIM is the Freddie tax exempt loan. It provides all the things that the Fannie MTIM does as far as structure goes. So your underwriting is very similar, 40-year AM, 115 debt coverage. You're getting that 15 to 18-year perm term. The biggest difference on this is there are not publicly offered bonds being sold with the tax exempt loan program. And there's really truly no bonds. It's a tax exempt note. So you still have to qualify for your allocation. You still have to meet that 50% bond test, but Freddie is issuing a tax exempt note. So the question that came up in the beginning of our presentation, is the issuer also the government lender? In this program, they are. So the language of how the parties are identified are a little bit different, since this is a loan and not a bond. But it does, I think you can probably go, I don't know do we have the slide that shows how the funds flow?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so see here, it's a fiscal agent, and there you go, thank you. I love y'all's slides.
You don't have to read any of the documents, just look at the emojis of how the flow of funds.
Exactly. So the biggest difference in the structure of the TEL versus the Fannie is that the construction loan is also tax exempt. So you'll have the tax exempt construction loan once the property I'm sorry, let me step back. The construction loan is considered the initial funding loan, and that loan is made to the governmental lender to fund the mortgage loan that has matching economic terms. And then the perm lender is considered the funding lender, and the perm lender would purchase the funding loan from the construction lender once the property is built, and then the perm lender steps in and the debt service payments are made to, in this case, Freddie. So, you know, when we were going back about comparing the programs, you know, the Freddie Tel does have cost of issuance savings because you're not selling the bonds. However, they're priced differently, like we mentioned, right? So the Freddie Tel is priced over the 10-year treasury, where the publicly offered bonds are priced over the MMD. And so your interest rates right now and historically have been higher on the TELs than they have on the MTEBs. So the savings doesn't always offset the lesser proceeds that you're getting from the TEL. So you really do need to do a good comparison with your lending partners to determine which is best for your deal.
Yeah, and there's so many other considerations, and maybe Elsie can also chat about this, but you know, the issuer factor can, you know, influence which execution that you're going to decide on. Your timing, some of these executions offer early rate lock, and some of them take a little bit longer, but may have a lower rate or more favorable terms. So just kind of
Equity pricing can be affected by your structure. There's a lot that goes into it, just looking at rates.
And folks wanna like one size fits all, but it really just doesn't work. Every state is different, every market within that state, every neighborhood is different, you know, so that equity pricing can shift depending on the CRA need and kind of where those different projects are located. So just having kind of an open mind and looking at these different executions, like kind of a fresh glance each time, and kind of staying on top of what's happening in the market. As Gina mentioned, things can change really quickly. So, you know, we've worked on deals that were a TEL, and then we shifted to a cash back forward, which is a publicly offered bond married with a TEL takeout. And so there are times when you have to be nimble on your project, and just having a great working relationship with your lender and your underwriter can help to make those decisions quickly.
And it can come down to, like, we have 2 deals closing in the next month, and we've already locked in what our structure is. And now with the volatility in the past 2 weeks, that has changed significantly of just how we think through the project. And we're still obviously just maintaining the structure that we've chosen at this point, given the timing. But it can definitely change just even once that structure has been analyzed, and you know, we've taken all the factors into play. And then there are things outside of everyone here's control that obviously can shift that.
Well, we've seen a lot of requests for the slides. I think Ashley responded that the slides and recording are going to be sent around to everyone who is registered, so no need to send your requests in the chat. We'll get you the information. And that includes our contact information as well. So please don't hesitate to reach out to any of us with additional questions. And I'll be at the summit, so I hope to see some of y'all there. Please check out our bonds, our second bond session that will be at that event. But I'll pass it back over to Millie.
Yeah, I just want to say thanks for staying on a little bit over here. And thank you to all of our wonderful presenters and all of their knowledge and expertise. And we'll look to see you at the summit and in the next bond series training. So have a wonderful, wonderful day, because we're a little cheesy, and we will see you soon. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.